Hi, I'm Dris Organica, and thanks for tuning in to The Working Musician. Today I'm going to talk about how loud is too loud. Okay, so anybody who's really been around the forums, especially when it comes to mastering, there's been a lot of debate in recent years about how loud is too loud, but I want to kind of take it outside of just the mastering, mixing, so to speak, arena, and take it out into a few other concepts and just, maybe when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, maybe it'll shed a little bit more light on the topic of how loud is too loud. Okay, I'll go ahead and just get the initial obvious out of the way. Okay, so anybody who's ever heard of dynamic range day or anything like that, especially if you're kind of in the mixing community and especially online, you hear just so much about people going on and on about how albums today are just have no dynamics and they're just loud and limited to the point of their distortion to where they start clipping. And hey, what's your new favorite haircut? Hey, you like this? This is called digital clipping. Yeah. There was a funny little skit on a forum I saw one time of an image and it was like, hey, you like my new hair? And it was just like a solid wave with no dynamics whatsoever. It's called digital clipping, you know? So, I'm not entirely sure why it's such a big debate because at the end of the day, if people like how something sounds, cool. Now, there is definitely something to be said about things sounding worse over the years. And, I'll be the first one to say that, yeah, there is something to be said about the state of today's albums just being so loud and so hyped and compressed and limited to the point where there is a little bit of clipping in there. And I mean, if you take it to the extreme with Metallica's Death Magnetic, I guess there's kind of two ways to look at it. You could either say this is just loudness wars gone wrong, this is ridiculous, or hey, maybe it took somebody like Metallica to really push the envelope and just to say exactly how far is too far. Well, I think it's a pretty good consensus that most people say, okay, that's definitely too far. Hey, kudos for them for, being able to have that kind of credibility and brand name to be able to do something like that, have it put out and it still sells, I think it's kind of funny of all people, but as much as I love Metallica, hey, I like the Death Magnetic album. Do I think it's probably a little distorted? Yeah, but hey, I in some ways I kind of think it works. On a very good monitoring system, I would say absolutely not. But you know what? On my laptop speakers and car speakers, it's not that big of a deal. It just sounds like, a modern rock album to me. But, something to take into consideration when it comes to that is, there is definitely something to be said about the loudness wars and how it relates to how people more so in the home studio environments do things. Because, when you get an album and it's just so quiet that you have to crank it up and you can actually hear, self noise from your speakers starting to come into play from the amps on them. Yeah, it just sounds kind of cheap and amateur. We're at a point where it seems like anything that is not clean is not modern. And if it's not modern and clean, it's not, relevant or good sounding, I guess, to our ears, because that's what we're used to. But now we've gotten to the point where things are crisp to the point of distorted, So is there really a balance there? I'm sure there is, but if you're a home musician or in your own studio or you go and pay the money and rehearse and go to a studio, it is something to think about because how loud does something really need to be for it to be effective? I'll kind of put my own little twist on this. I do master from home on my own material and have done some mastering on other people's material that have been mixed in quote unquote pro studios. Now, just a disclaimer when I say that, while yes, they may have been mixed at pro studios, I'm not going to say that they were necessarily mastered at pro studios. It was one of those things where, I kind of feel for the mix engineer having his hands tied just by the extreme limited budget and the artist wants the mix by the time they leave after they're done tracking. Something that I find is pretty common with rappers. They don't. The concept of a mix is a little bit different when you've got a stereo music file and then you're rapping over it. Well, sure, there's secondary vocals and all that kind of thing. I've found a lot of times what their final mix is. While yes, it's loud-ish, but it's nowhere near what I would say a finished mastered product would be. And that's pretty common with people who just get, final mixes, or my favorite are when they get a rough mix because they don't have the money or didn't budget in to actually have something mixed properly. And so what they end up getting and what I end up receiving is something that's like definitely in need of some mastering. And I have a tendency to push the envelope as far as I can before it becomes just audible. But I kind of can't help but notice a lot of people really do seem to like things pushed really hot slash crunchy slash pumpy, all that kind of thing. And me personally, on my own material, I usually push it pretty hot just because I just feel like if it's not loud enough, or at least within 6 decibels or so of a professionally mastered and mixed product, that I'm kind of behind the curve. The truth of the matter is my recordings are not done in pro studios. They're mostly done here. While I have gone to pro studios and had stuff done, I still end up mastering it at home. And I found that a lot of it comes down to your peaks and your transients. Just more high-end gear that costs a lot more money really tends to pick up those transients. And I find that your peaks tend to be higher and there tends to be more dynamics. And you don't really have to limit things to quite the level that you do with professionally recorded material, as opposed to if I go home and do something on, let's say, a sub $500 interface using the stock preamps and converters. So definitely there is something to be said about the gear you use to record things will play a final role and effect on how you master things, because the transients seem to be a little bit clipped, or not clipped. The transients seem to be a little bit lesser, and so I tend to push something that I might have recorded myself a little bit hotter, just because there's not those peaks really hitting the edge of the 0 decibel sound threshold. But then I go plug in a wave from, like, let's say an Incubus CD or something like that, and I notice they seem to have a lot of dynamics, and it's not just a solid black bar on my DAW, yet it's still louder than what I'm doing, and it's just solid. I mean, you hardly see any gray on your waveform. So definitely there is something to be said about that. Bottom line is, if you're not working in with high-end studio gear, you're probably going to have to do things a little bit differently to achieve the same perceived sound quality and loudness that a professionally recorded, mixed, and mastered CD would. And bottom line is, certain styles of music just are able to be pushed a little bit hotter than others. Soft acoustic folk music just does not sound good when it's pushed hard and crunchy. Yet hip hop and modern rock seems to work a little bit better. So let's move on from that, because that's kind of like the obvious thing that people tend to think of when I say how loud is too loud, right? But something else to take this into is into the live arena. I tell you, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a show and it's just like, guys, turn it down. It's giving. If I'm going to a local bar to see a cover band and listen to live music from the classic hits from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I really don't need that loud in my face. But sure enough, here comes Mr. Guitar Player, with his treble all the way boosted. And this, if there's a sound guy here, he can't, he's half deaf and he's just cranking the highs on the board. And it's just, I can't even stand it. Now, in all fairness, I tend to be a little bit more sensitive, especially in the last 5 or so years, as I've really gotten more and more so into mixing and developed my ear. But it's just like, it gives me a headache. And so how loud is too loud in the live arena? Okay, let's just say you're at a bar doing covers. you really don't need to be playing that loud. And more importantly, it's not about one particular instrument over the other. It's about a good overall blend and being able to hear everything so well. At some point, if things are so loud, everything sounds bad. You can't discern one thing from the other. And I tend to actually appreciate it when bands don't crank it up all the way. I mean, there's no reason to push it past 11. I mean, when I've played live shows, I still have it, a Marshall JCM 2000. I mean, here it's a 100-watt tube head. And I tell you, there's not too many times I pushed that thing past 3 or 4, and it was plenty loud, especially if you're being mic'd by the house. It's just not necessary. At the same time, there is something to be said about pushing your speakers, whether it be on the front of house or on your guitar or bass amp speakers. If you push them too low, they just don't seem to sound quite as crisp as they would if you push them just a little bit hotter. But there's definitely not what I would call exactly a super fine line. I mean, you should kind of know just by practicing what that range is. If you practice in your garage with your band, and you tend to notice that, hey, you usually keep your guitar amp at around 5 out of 10, and that seems to be about right, more than likely that'll be pretty close to what you need in a bar scene or in a venue. Obviously, if the thing is huge, you might push it a little bit, but more than likely you'll have a sound guy, if it's that big, miking you, right? So you just need to make sure that your guitar speakers are being pushed just loud enough to where the sound quality is at an optimum. And usually it's nowhere near 75%. Very seldomly do I find it really reasonable, at least on large, 50, 100-watt speaker and amp combos, that you really need to go much past 50%, if even. I think the rule of about 30 to 40% is pretty close to where you usually need to be. And of course, this will change and vary depending on whether you're using valve state, tube, or what have you. And also just the power of your front of house speakers. So taking that to another note, let's get out of the cover scene and do more of the originals. This is where it really gets bad, especially with the metal bands. Man, they just play so loud. I mean, it's already distorted, and by the time they're done, everything just sounds like a wall of distortion. So I used to love it when the band like that would play ahead of me. It's like, okay, cool. That's how loud you play. Let me turn it down so you can actually tell what's going on. And I've never once had anybody say, hey, why do y'all play so quiet? They didn't really realize we were playing quieter. They just noticed, hey, y'all really sound very good, So there's definitely something to be said about, guys, turn it down a little bit. Obviously, if you can hear what the people at the tables are saying, or what the bars, if you can hear people ordering drinks at the bar while you're playing too soft. But outside of that, you're probably fine. So let's move it on to another area where is loud too loud? Okay. Guys, I know we all want to make our parts known, especially when we're playing in a band, but the more me syndrome is probably one of the biggest things that just kills bands. And it's not just hey, I have to hear myself. It's the ego behind it, the more me syndrome. And you find this in the studio as well, especially when people are mixing. It's like, I understand you're the bass player and you want your part to be heard and appreciated, but it's just not necessary for a soft acoustic driven rock song to have this monster bass. It just doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? You're not Flea. You're not the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Turn it down. It doesn't make sense. Yet the bass player says, oh, I like it, but the bass needs to be up. Then the guitar player, yeah, it's cool, but now the guitar needs to be up. And the vocal, by the time you're done, you're clipping. And at that point, they're like, yeah, I like this, but it's starting to sound kind of shitty. Well, yeah, well, no joke. That's because you all can't be the loudest instrument at the same time and expect good things to happen. I don't know, maybe that's what drove the loudness wars with mastering. More me, more me. Okay, here you go. Let's take it back to the studio. When it comes to mixing, if you know you're going to be mixing for a long period of time, just understand it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Your ears are going to get fatigued. Especially if you're mixing on headphones, or heaven forbid, earbuds. And hey, I've been there where that's what I had to use. And I had a set of earbuds that I was very comfortable with, and I got just very used to mixing on them, and I knew their limitations. Now, obviously, I would cross-reference them on multiple sets of other headphones and speakers, monitors, what have you, the car, laptop speakers. But if you're going to be mixing, you just go ahead and get used to it now. Like, start from day one. I don't care if you're a beginner, amateur, or whether you've been doing this a while. You ought to know. And well, if you've been doing this a while, it's not like I got to tell you. Turn those things down. I mean, not like a listening volume. Like if you're listening to music and, just in your car or sitting down on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to music, relaxing, or just vegging out. You don't play it that loud. I mean, just loud enough to where you can tell what's going on. And then, you also have to realize that the way you hear things is going to change depending on how loud they are. There's always more treble and bass the louder you go. So you're not making very good mix decisions when you play things at just blast loud. Now, maybe if you're trying to critique what you think is your final mix and just making slight edits, then yeah, go ahead and crank them. You know what I mean? That's fine for 5 or 10 minutes. Crank it. That's fine. But if you think you're going to mix for 5 to 10 hours with your speakers cranked, you probably won't make it past an hour or two before you've just got this screaming headache and your just ears are bleeding and you're no longer able to be objective on what sounds good or bad. Staying within the realm of the studio, something else to keep in mind is when you're tracking, your headphone mix really does play, and volumes plays a big role in the performance. And if you've ever been in this situation like I have where you're recording vocals, there is definitely something to be said about if your headphone mix is loud, you tend to sing louder. If it's soft, you tend to sing softer. So you find that happy balance and you're good. But if the headphone mix is too loud or louder than it needs to be to effectively sing the song with a little bit of vibe and character, you're going to find that after 2 songs, you're just done. And I mean, if you've paid for a full day and your goal is to track vocals for half of it and lay down guitars for half of it, you've basically just got to a point where you've got 2 hours at tops. A lot of singers can't make it much past an hour in the studio, even under ideal circumstances, at singing properly with good headphone mixes and everything and well rehearsed. So if you think you're going to make it for 4 hours of tracking vocals with a headphone mix that's way too loud, it's just no way, because you're going to have to overcompensate for that for how loud you sing. And this is another little thing that you're likely to experience. If your engineer is tracking you, something that he and you both need to keep in mind is that as you're doing double takes or doing backing vocals, those vocals stacking on top of each other progressively get louder and louder. It may not be that big of a deal as you're, layering your second part of a four voice harmony, but by the time you're ready to do your 4th or 5th voice on that harmony part, I mean, it is so loud because they're just stacked and layering on top of each other that it's just, by the time you're doing that last part, you are just screaming to be able to hear what's going on. I had this happen to myself. It was just, burning the midnight oil. Okay, we got the vocal for this song tracked. I just got to get all the backup parts. And it's one of those instances where I usually don't have that many backup parts, but this one had just a ton. During like the bridge, I probably had somewhere between, I would say easily eight vocal lines going on at the same time. Now that might kind of be an extreme case, but oh my goodness, we're just trying to get it done. And I knew it was going to happen, but I was just trying to get it done. And so I saved the high part for last because it was extremely high. And I knew that, hey, if I'm going to be doing this, I might not be able to do much else afterwards, at least not with the best studio tone I could. And I tell you, I had nothing left by the time I was done doing that last high harmonization. And in addition to it being high, which I can normally hit, the reason why is in order for me to really hear myself and sing it in tune, which it took me about 3 or 4 tries to really get it something decent. I I was just shot and completely hoarse, more so than normal. So if you haven't experienced that yet, just take my word for it. It's worth taking the minute to have the engineer adjust the levels, especially when you're doing backing vocals, so that everything sits comfortably when you're singing. Now let's talk about listening levels in your vehicle. It's pretty common to want to blast it, right? But keep in mind that while you can get away with it here and there and it's not going to cause long-term damage or anything like that, I tell you, some of the secondhand rap I hear is at offensive volumes, 4 lanes over and 8 cars back in traffic. I cannot imagine the damage being done to the person in the vehicle's ears. I mean, hopefully for their sake, they're not into the sound industry in any way, shape, or form, or don't value their hearing, because that will cause damage to your hearing. I mean, end of story. Down to the point where I really have the strong suspicion that a lot of today's youth, between the earbuds and the just extreme affordability of just crazy high powered stereo speakers and systems for your car, and just, testosterone, I can only imagine how deaf the people, this current generation is going to be when they're in their 50s and 60s. So just, another little thing to think about. Because at the end of the day, there is something to be said. Hey, if it's too loud, you're too old. But at the same time, if you want to be able to do this for a while, turn it down.